Good evening from the nation's capital. I'm Kelly Wright. Thank you for joining us tonight as we spend this next hour together. As always, I do sincerely hope that wherever you are, that you're safe and well, taking care of yourself and your family as we grapple with this COVID-19 pandemic, which does not appear to be subsiding, but actually escalating and rising. Which leads me to my opening observations. On Tuesday, Dr. Anthony Fauci testified here on Capitol Hill. He talked about the spread of the coronavirus and he gave a dire warning. If we are not careful, if we do not safeguard ourselves, we could see an uptick to as much as 100,000 cases per day. That's alarming. But he did state that one of the simplest ways to flatten this curve and to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus is to do what I'm doing now. Simply wear a face mask. And it appears now that some prominent Republicans are standing in agreement with that. For example, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell stated that what we should be doing is not stigmatizing people wearing a face mask, that it's good and proper for safeguarding ourselves and each other. So let's stop the politics of what we do in terms of wearing a face mask in public. Let's get more humanitarian and more basic with the needs of understanding that we are in this together. It's not a political ploy. It's actually a move to save lives. And those are my opening observations.
So today we're having a conversation. We're talking to people about what's happening in our lives here in America. We have the coronavirus and we have the virus of racism, and then we have this political division. And I thought I would start with someone who represents DeKalb County, Georgia, there in the Atlanta area. She is a commissioner there, DeKalb County Commissioner, Lorraine Cochran Johnson. Thanks for joining us this evening, and tell us, if you will, what your concerns are about Atlanta moving forward in the aftermath of Rayshard Brooks, a man shot in his back by an Atlanta police officer, and then the unrest that ensued after that. And then compounding matters, you still have coronavirus.
Yes, and thank you so much, Kelly. It's always a wonderful conversation when we're able to speak. It's unfortunate that we are, shall I say, at a very pivotal time. The culmination of both unprecedented social unrest as we deal with a global pandemic, and Rayshard Brooks, I think, is for Atlanta and the metro Atlanta area. I think it was just for us a huge turning point, because we are just, shall I say, dealing with the ramifications that have happened globally as it relates to George Floyd and his death. Many Americans, for the first time, and I can say for me, it was the first time that I literally watched a video and saw a man lose his life over the span of about 8 minutes. I can remember not wanting to watch the video because I was already aware of the outcome. But I think that for many Americans, to watch a man who is in a total position of submission be murdered was jolting and shocking to one's conscience. I think in America, for far too long, we have allowed people, particularly Black and brown people, to be told that we did not see what we saw, or that we did not have the experience that we have actually experienced. The death of Rayshard Brooks in particular was polarizing because we were in the middle of dealing with the death of George Floyd. And having not only a local conversation here throughout Metro Atlanta, and being an elected official, the conversations, the emails that I've received have been very touching, because I see that across socioeconomic lines, across racial lines, people are hurt. Yeah. So to see his death, I think for all people, but particularly Metro Atlanta, it was the timing of it could not have been worse because there was such a consciousness of policing, of outcomes. And Atlanta is known as a Black Mecca. It is a city that has been recognized for decades as being the epitome of success of African American people. So to see this was unsettling and very disturbing. And there is a far greater conversation too, because when you look at the totality of the circumstances that surrounded his death, as he was shot in the back, you have a critical conversation about how did we get here? Because I also respect our officers and have a very difficult job to do. In many communities, even as we speak, tensions are high between our police officers and communities that they serve. So how do we as individuals, regardless of track records, conduct ourselves in a way that's conducive to us all having the best possible outcome? There's just a lot of conversations to be had around his death.
And we're coming back with more of my interview after the break. A lot of healing underway. We do know that the police chief resigned that night and that you have moved forward. The city itself and the counties surrounding have looked at police officers and discussed police reform. And you're talking about the respect that you have police officers because there are a lot of good cops out there.
There are.
And the bad cops make it bad for everybody. So the national cry initially was defund, and now the national outcry is let's reform. Are you satisfied with first of all, the local reform that's underway there? And then what do you say to the national reform that still has to take place?
Yes, and let me also say that the resignation of Erica Shields, from many, and particularly people like me who have had the opportunity to interact with her, her as an individual, to understand her character, and also her level of professionalism was also a huge blow because she is an extremely qualified person. So it was disturbing to see her resign, although based on all communications, it was of her own free will. When we start to talk about, moving forward and looking at where we are, it's a very interesting conversation because ironically, prior to the death of George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks, I had brought in a legislative consultant and we were looking at police policy as it relates to how they do their job. And I think former President Barack Obama said it best when he said it is time for us to critically review policy. When we have conversations about defunding officers, I caution people to be very careful. If we could live in a society that did not require policing and governance, it would be a wonderful thing, but we do not. Not having officers is not an option. It is not. We would have a society of chaos independent of laws and people that have the ability to enforce them. What we do need to do is ensure that we have the best possible policies and that we do not protect officers who have demonstrated a record of failure to adhere to policy. One of the things that disturbs me is when you open the file of an officer who has multiple infractions. And those police records are often not available to the public and or sealed. I believe that there are some precincts across the United States that have a culture. I think review of police files and a careful analysis of history, because whether you're in corporate America or you're in public service, there has to be tools of measurement and there are guidelines to determine when an individual performs their job adequately or if there is room for improvement. And I think because of the culture of policing, because of the stress associated with arriving on a call and you not knowing the possible outcome, that officers are in some instances given more, shall I say, lenience because of those circumstances. But we cannot afford that. We can't afford to have that happen as we move forward. So I do think that it's time for us to come together and have the critical and courageous conversation on policing and the laws and guidelines that govern them. I'm also very concerned with forcing officers to become social scientists, psychologists, and social workers. That is not what they've signed up for. And across the country, there has been an exodus of police officers in urban cities because they're now very concerned about how do I do my job? When there are guidelines, I attended law school and every crime has an element.
Yeah.
When those elements are in place, that's how you determine how you charge an individual, whether it's first degree, second degree murder, malice murder. Every crime has an element. And I want us to allow officers to do their job to the letter of law. And when there is an opportunity that they deem for somewhat discretion, that's fine. But we have to be cautious as we look at those requirements, because if all elements are in place for an arrest, then an officer who deems that an arrest is in order should have that ability to make an arrest. It should not become that each and every case must be weighed to determine how to handle it, because the letter of the law has already described that. So I think there's a lot of conversations, critical conversations that have to be had around policing. Also, officers that fail to adhere to policy should be held to swift action. They should be removed. We should not have officers that have multiple infractions and a demonstrated history of improper action.
I know we have to revisit this. We'll have to come back and talk to you more about what's happening in Georgia. I appreciate you for everything that you're doing for DeKalb County. I've been talking to DeKalb County Commissioner Lorraine Cochran Johnson, incredible woman of faith and doing some great work there throughout the Atlanta area. Appreciate you and appreciate your leadership there and your service to your community. And we'll be back with more after this. Joining me now is my guest, attorney Mark Harris. He is the managing partner of the Ben Crump Law Firm based in California. And Mark, you're here to talk to us today about a myriad of topics because you're also an economist. Before we get into the economic aspects, I want to talk about what's happening in the legal aspects as it pertains to the case of Elijah McClain in Colorado. We are finding so much out of this a year later. And then, of course, a month removed from what happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, yet it underscores why so many African Americans and now white Americans are out there protesting for justice now for Elijah McClain. Bring us up to date, please.
Sure. I like the way you frame this, Kelly. The fact that we're talking about America as we get ready to celebrate America's independence. One of the things that we all embrace is the fact that we're Americans. I told people I'll never let anybody take my faith or my patriotism away. I've earned both multi-generationally. And so I'm just as much an American and just as proud to be an American as anybody else should be. Having said that, as a lawyer and as a civil rights advocate, I have embraced the fact that America is separated from its aspirational goals, meaning it talks a good game, as we used to say, but it doesn't always play a good game. Our job is to hold America accountable. And so in the case of young Elijah McClain in Aurora, Colorado, the more I learn of what happened in that case, Kelly, the more my heart breaks. This was a special needs, gentle soul, gentle spirit, special needs individual who was living his life and living his best life and had his life snatched away from him and his loved ones inappropriately. This is a horrible set of facts.
What could the Crump firm do to bring not only attention to Elijah McClain, but all of these cases? Because we really do have a problem in this country. And I know our detractors, those who would be on the conservative side, who would point fingers at Black America and say, well, what about Black on Black crime? Well, what about white on white crime? Let's get down to the nub of this. This is a situation that's been going on and on for years, and actually for 400 years, where we've had a conflict with men and women in authority dealing justly with African Americans.
I mean, the mere volume of these cases ought to really bother everyone. I keep going to the fact that this is the Black man's burden. This is the Black woman's burden, the Black community's burden, but it's not ours to be borne alone. If a person like young Elijah McClain is treated the way he is, if all the other persons, the victims that you mentioned, are treated the way that they are or have been, none of us is safe. I am blessed to work with Ben Crump, because what we're doing as a law firm is not just going after litigation. We're not just going after settlements or verdicts. That is not enough in terms of this battle. That brings a very small level of satisfaction to a family who's lost a loved one. And it's not a very big level of satisfaction at all. Every single client that we've had in this area, Kelly, has said, I'd much rather have my loved one back. I'd much rather have my son, my daughter, my brother, my sister, my husband, my father, my mother back than to be in the situation that we're in, where we're talking about how many zeros to put to the end of a check. Yeah. So let's not get it twisted. We're real focused on what we're trying to do, and that's to bring justice to those who at this point have had justice leap over their community. And in this country, that's the African-American community in large measure.
So much more to talk about. We'll get right to it after this. We are seeing some changes in terms of how police conduct themselves. In Virginia, for example, it's been announced that that every police officer in Virginia will, when they engage in a stop, they will have to ask that individual to identify their race. That way they're able to take an accounting of how much of an exchange and interchange they have with all races. And then we can have a track record of what's going on in terms of how they treat Black Americans and for that matter, anyone.
I mean, that's a good start. There are a lot of good efforts in Sacramento, California. A dear friend and former business colleague is on the city council here, Alan Warren. And Alan Warren introduced an idea to have law enforcement make sure they have business cards with all their identifying information on them anytime they encounter the public in any kind of a police call. So the first thing they should do is identify themselves to make sure that a record is established. What you're talking about, Kelly, is what is necessary to be able to provide us with the analytics, to provide us with the data, to be able to prove a pattern and a practice. The law requires that we prove a pattern and a practice in order to be able to stop certain kinds of conduct. And these efforts will help us do that. Now, are they a replacement for ferreting out bad officers? No. Are they a replacement for reforming police departments and law enforcement agencies? No. But these are incremental steps that will be important in building a record that hopefully we can take before a judge and jury and get justice for our community.
You're watching The Kelly Wright Show. More to come after the break. So joining me now to discuss the coronavirus and the virus of racism and the political divisions in our country is Dr. Joseph Green, and I should mention Reverend Dr. Joseph Green. He is the former chairman of the 1619 African American Commission that was signed into law basically by Congress and signed by President Donald Trump to actually acknowledge the 400 years of our contributions and our accomplishments in this country, dating all the way back to 1619 in Port Comfort, Virginia. So, Doc, it's good of you to join us today, and you're there in the state capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. Let me ask you from your standpoint as a pastor and as the former chairman of this commission that's been going around the country, educating people and informing people and inspiring people about our contributions as African Americans to this country. What's your take on what's going on there in Pennsylvania as well as other states as we see the coronavirus continue to spread and rise?
One of the things that I've seen, of course, there's a lot of fear, a lot of unsurety that's occurring in our communities, and then you have this incident with the George Floyd killing of George Floyd, and I see it's really, the atmosphere is very rife for division, separation, because people are naturally at a heightened sense of frustration right now. I think that the fact that we were all shut in for a couple of months added to the frustration. And so what I see is, things that were under the surface for a long time are now coming to a head. And it's almost like a volcano. There's an explosion that is occurring with things that have been underlying, for many years. The conversations that should have been had, the issues that should have been dealt with hadn't been dealt with. And so now they're coming out. And unfortunately, bad situations like this bring out the worst in people, but it also brings out the best. So I do see a concerted effort on the part of many people to try to have this, a conversation about reconciliation, about justice, about balancing the scales, and all those things that this country was founded on, but hasn't always lived up to, to its billing.
I was there when you sponsored an event at the U.S. Capitol. You've had many events there in Washington, and there at the U.S. Capitol, I recall you had Nick Cannon, who was a spokesperson for the commission, as well as Bernice King, the youngest child of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I was struck by how you and both of them, Nick Cannon and Bernice King, talking about how we have to acknowledge the contributions and accomplishments of African Americans. And this was before we ever knew of a COVID-19 and before we ever had George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And to your point about reconciliation, Bernice King said, we have been flim-flam, bamboozled, and a psychological number has been done on African Americans. And now we're seeing it carried out in what's happening with the fact that we have police reform that hasn't really gone right yet. We have this division that's causing a lot of heartbreak and pain. As a member of the commission, how do you keep it going forward so that we can bring some healing and solutions to our community?
Well, the first thing we always have to have is open and honest conversations. I deal with a lot of people, not only in our community, but outside of our community. And as African Americans, we have to understand that there's a large segment of people that don't know right? They don't know what they don't know. So they don't know about some of our pain, our struggles. Many of them don't know a lot about our history, the history of race relations in America. And so I approach it from a standpoint of trying to educate, trying to bring healing, trying to bring us together. Because if I start off with the mindset that people outside of our community just don't care about our community, then it could allow me to have a heightened sense of frustration that doesn't lead to constructive conversations. And so I see a lot of that happening. You know, a lot of times when I have conversations, I've done a lot of seminars, I've done a lot of talks and different things like that. And there's a lot of white Americans and other nationalities that don't know much about our history. They don't know about Jim Crow. They don't know about the injustices in the criminal justice system. And because they don't know, they haven't responded. And of course, we have to be careful as Black people not to come from a place of offense. And I think it's so important that as we have these conversations, that people come together, that we not only understand that education, enlightenment, and exposure help us to heal, but also it helps us to bridge the gap. Because you know, when we do come together, you know, other races like First Nations people, you know, they have a long history of being mistreated and traumatized in this country as well. And so I've made a lot of alliances with the First Nations people. We've had a lot of people that came alongside of us, even in with the commission. You know, when Martin Luther King so famously marched forward across the bridge in Selma, and the other you know, the other civil rights, great civil rights work that he did, it was with the help of people outside of our culture, right? White people, Jewish people, other people had to come alongside of us. And that's how we're going to move forward, right? We're going to move forward by reaching outside of our community, having constructive conversations, and coming from a place that we want to heal and reconcile, and not from a place of offense or blame.
Sir, I appreciate you coming on, and the commission it's still active. Now, have you had the occasion to talk to the president and the president's people about how they can actively get engaged to provide words that are conciliatory and bring people together? Because he's been criticized soundly for not doing that and not coming out forcefully enough and compassionately to address the racial divide.
Yeah, I do know. I haven't spoken with him personally on this issue, but I know some of his senior advisors, and most of them are African American, and all of them are believers. The one I spoke with, and he does have people around him that gives him, you know, these tidbits of wisdom. I think he's in a very and I'm not speaking for him, obviously, but from my estimation, he's in a very you know, like a very tricky situation, because when he says things, a lot of times he's criticized because, hey, you don't have the right to speak on this. When he doesn't say anything, then they call him inconsiderate. I think that he could absolutely do a lot better at demonstrating more compassion in his words, and avoiding some of the harsh words that he uses, because that kind of fans the flames at times. But you know, at the end of the day, Kelly, we have to fix our community, right? We have to fix ourselves. The president is a person and an authority, but at the end of the day, we have to, you know, hold people accountable. The politicians, the judges, we have to hold them accountable. We need the system to be, you know, lined up to have equal justice for everybody. Whenever we identify people that are operating from bigotry or bias or whatever, they need to be held accountable. Absolutely. We do need to minister to those like President Trump, who may or may not know how to articulate this very tricky situation, because I know, as a person who's been doing this for years, and you probably have this experience too, even on a personal level, these are very difficult conversations that have to be nuanced properly in order for us to avoid some of the negative interactions that we have.
For one moment, just bear with me. If we strip away the nuance and strip away just the fact that he's the president of the United States, and just boil down to man, man is if he's going to espouse a belief in faith in God, does that not state that you need to sit down at the table of brotherhood and have a conversation with people, just as you do with your senior African American advisors, and with a conversation with the entire nation that sets a tone of reconciliation, sets a tone of admitting that racism does exist and bigotry does exist and prejudice does exist? And while all three of those, as you've mentioned, are matters of the heart, he has an opportunity to actually move this forward by giving an open dialogue to all members of society, particularly Black Americans who have been disproportionately affected through coronavirus. And now we have the distrust between the police and the Black community. And we're trying to get reform. We're trying to get things changed so that we don't have more George Floyds or Rayshard Brooks or Elijah McClain or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And I will tell you from personal experience that there's been a lot of times that the president has reached out to people in the community, activists and leaders. And if you recall, when he first took over office, that he would invite many of these leaders to come and sit down. And a lot of them, even some of the congressional leaders, said, we're not going to sit down and talk with you. And when people did go talk to him, they were kind of castigated and marginalized. I would just encourage him to continue to do so, to continue to reach out and sit down and talk. But we also, our leaders have a responsibility also to sit down when that invitation is extended. You probably remember even with the Kanye West incident, when he sat down with the president and they made him, and Steve Harvey and some others, and they were really treated as outcasts in our society because they said, you shouldn't go sit and talk to him because he's a racist. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. Those conversations need to be had, but we also, our leaders have to sit down when the invitation is extended as well.
The Reverend Dr. Joseph Green, thank you, sir, for being a part of the program today. Please come back, because this is a conversation that all of us need to have on the left, on the right, Black and white, conservative, liberal, independent, all betwixt and between. We've got to have this conversation, and I will keep doing it. And when the president does something that I don't agree with, I'll call it, just like he would probably do to all members of the news. He likes to call it fake news. I like to say, well, let's have the real news. Let's have a real conversation. So when you talk to the president, tell him he's welcome on this program anytime, because I'd love to have this conversation that perhaps opens up some dialogue between not only a president and a member of the media, but Blacks and whites and racial reconciliation.
Absolutely. And you know, Kelly, you're just what we need. Your type of journalism, because you're seeking truth. I've never known you to come with any type of partisan agenda, that you're just seeking truth and for healing. And that's what we really need. We need to put those things over our side, right? Whether you're conservative, liberal, or Democrat, Republican, we have to put the nation's best interests over our own personal agendas in order for this to work.
That's right, my friend.
So I appreciate you, brother.
Thank you. I appreciate you for saying that. Thank you so much. You know how I lean. I'd rather trust in God than man.
Amen. There you go. I'm with you on that one, 100%.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you. Keep doing the great work that you're doing with that commission and enlightening people and educating them about, as I stated before, our accomplishments and contributions as African Americans have contributed greatly to this country and to the world. Thanks again.
Absolutely. It wouldn't be America without us.
Amen. We'll be back with more of the show after this. Welcome back to the program, and I'm delighted to talk to George and Tondra Gregory as they join us for strengthening the family. And certainly in times like these, Lord knows we need to strengthen our families, because we are being bombarded by every side, it seems, George and Tondra. And you guys deal with this. And we've been having a lot of conversations on the show and having dialogue about race, about Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, politics, as well as the coronavirus. And the one thing that I think is important is that we learn to listen to each other. Mm-hmm. You guys want to weigh in on that?
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. There's,
Well, Kelly, first of all, it's always a pleasure for Tandra and I to be on your show, Journey for Life. We feel like you are a friend of ours, and I'm here helping to take care of my mother in North Carolina, while my wife is in California. But what we realize is this, is what America is facing is no different than the microcosm of what families face. And that is, the big question is, can you hear me now, right?
Mm-hmm.
You remember years ago, the Verizon man used to go from bridge to building to whatever structure, trying to test the network to say, can you hear me now? And that's the question that we've got to ask in our families. Really, can you hear me now? We have a over communication problem now, meaning we've got so many ways that we can communicate: text messages, Zoom, we've got phone calls that we can do, we can text, and yet we're more divided on what we hear each other say than unlike any other time in history.
Yes, and communication is connection. And I just want to say that again. Communication is connection.
Oh,
If you're having a problem with connection with your spouse or with your neighbor or with anyone that you're having a conversation with, you have to look at the communication aspect. There may be some breakdown in your communication, and both parties have to look at that, because the whole goal of communication is for understanding to take place and for connection to take place. And listening is a rare skill, but it is a gift. It's a precious, genuine gift that you can give to anyone for them to feel understood and feel validated in their emotions. So it's a powerful, powerful gift. So that's why listening is an important part of bridging that gap. If you're not communicating, then you're going to feel disconnected.
In the midst of the protesting, in the midst of what's happening in Congress, in the midst of what's happening in the White House, in the midst of what's happening in the church house, a lot of people are talking loud. And as James Brown used to say, talking loud and saying nothing. And maybe they're saying something, but we're just not connecting enough to
sure.
actually communicate and hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is an important topic, especially during what's going on in our culture and in many families. And so one of the tips that we teach when we look at this topic of can you hear me now is some of this stuff is really simple, but listen, respect the speaker. Respect the speaker. Respect who's speaking at the time. Don't try to interrupt. Don't try to act as if you're listening when you're really not. My mother would say this as I was growing up. She would say, she would say stuff like, look at me when I'm talking to you, right? And so when we're talking to our spouses, we can't be on our video games or our phones or, just checking social media. We've got to give them that attention that they need. Why? It's because when we respect the speaker, they feel heard, they feel valued.
Yeah. And I don't know, it was breaking up, so I hope I'm not repeating what George was trying to say, but he was saying you respect the speaker, and that is by giving them face to face, face to face, and that you look them in the eye, you make that eye contact. It lets them know that you're engaging with what they're saying. And what that says is I'm paying attention to what you're saying. And Webster defines attention as giving the message that something is interesting and important. So that shows that you are really engaging and you're really trying to connect with that person.
Chandra and George, I mean, I think that's important advice that we need to practice in the home and outside of the home. That's we got to keep strengthening the family. So guys, keep coming back and keep delivering it. On Friday, I look forward to talking to you as well. We're gonna have actually a special on acknowledging a couple of men who have served in the Army and serving their country, all in time for July 4th. So I welcome you to address what do we do as a nation and as a proud nation that needs right now some humility so that we can learn to listen to each other.
That's right.
And become better, not bitter. George and Tonda Gregory of Journey for Life, NFL chaplains as well to the Los Angeles Chargers. Thank you both. Love you much.
God bless.
Thank you.
We'll
Bye.
be back with more after this.
Welcome back to the program, and now for my final word. As we continue to watch developments unfold in our country as we deal with the coronavirus, with racism, and with our political divide, the question we must ask ourselves is, what will we do for our future? Will we become a community, a beloved community, or will we fall into chaos? I choose to say that we can stand united and not be divided. We can overcome if we stand together and fight the coronavirus and the virus of racism and political division. We must do that together. Hopefully, you've been righted, ignited, and united to spread not racism or hatred or fear, but love, freedom, and peace. Good night.
It'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-changing. Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. The old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing. Now the line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast, as the present now will later be past. The order is rapid.